As is almost always the case in naval warfare, and for that matter in many other endeavours, the invention of some new technology or tactic that completely changes the landscape of conflict is soon met with various attempts at countering said innovation. Sometimes the response is swift, immediate and effective. Other times it's scattered and confused, and still other times it takes a while for the true scope of the threat and the supporting technologies surrounding the potential counter to come to full realisation. Since they were the first to come up with a practical counter to submarines, we're going to look at the British story in World War I. Far from being an incredibly backward organisation bent on maintaining whatever antiquated vision of the status quo that their admiralty had, albeit that charge may have had some validity at certain periods in the 19th century, the early 20th century Royal Navy was cautious but still highly interested in new technologies and their counters. The deployment of the first practical submarines around the turn of the 19th and into the 20th century had netted an almost immediate response, and at the end of 1903, the Royal Navy was already holding exercises to try and determine the best ways of countering and destroying submarines. The biggest single problem was finding the blasted things in the first place. Although submarines of the 1900s and 1910s couldn't move that fast, or really spend all that long underwater, it was usually enough that they could get far too close for comfort when it came to surface warships. But without some way of seeing through the water, the only time a submarine could be attacked was if it was surfaced, in which case normal gunfire could deal with it once you'd spotted the sub, or if it was at periscope depth. In this case, gunfire was extremely unlikely to be effective, and so this was the operational zone in which most early efforts for new weaponry concentrated. A submarine was almost as blind underwater as surface ships were to its presence, and the disputed date for the invention of the hydrophone was still approximately a decade away when the aforementioned early experiments began. This meant that for a submarine to attack a target, it would need to use the periscope to see the target, and assuming you could spot the periscope, which, to be fair, was itself a difficult proposition, you would have a window in which you could try and counter the sub before it in turn worked out how, where, and on what bearing it was going to fire its torpedoes. Ramming, of course, was an option, and indeed one of the earliest anti-submarine warfare exercises had to be curtailed when the submarine that was being hunted was accidentally rammed and sunk by a merchant ship that happened to be passing through the area. But in wartime, ramming presupposed that the ship in question was agile enough in order to get into a ramming position, and had no other obligations, such as maintaining its position in a column or in a line of battle, and of course that the ship was willing to risk giving the submarine a fairly simple firing solution by charging straight at it. Other anti-submarine techniques that were suggested at the time varied from the plausible all the way through to the bizarre. Some of the more pertinent to this particular account include a charge of 18.5 pounds of gun cotton, which was fitted with a timed fuse and a short loop of cable. The idea was to use a boat hook to slip the loop over the periscope of a submarine. Presumably this would be done from a torpedo boat or a larger ship's launch. The loop would then tighten as the submarine moved along, and the charge would detonate shortly thereafter. At minimum, this would blind the sub by destroying its ability to see, and at best it might even breach the conning tower and flood it, which might sink the sub in question. Another idea was a take on the paravane, which was normally used for minesweeping. This time there would be a small explosive charge attached to the kite, which is the thing at the end of the cable, and the kite and cable would then be streamed out, the ship would pass by the submarine, and the cable would then presumably catch on the sub's periscope, conning tower, propellers, or some other protuberance. The kite would then be drawn to the sub by the fact the ship was continuing to pass along, and the explosive charge could then be detonated remotely thanks to an electrical cable that was built into the streaming line, or you could put an impact fuse if you wanted. Various nets were also proposed. Everything from static nets with impact-activated flags that would signal when they'd caught a submarine, presumably at that point you had to go and do something about that, to something akin to a purse net used in fishing, with the idea that the ship would tow said net over the submarine, which they somehow knew where it was. The net would then catch the sub, and you could then draw in the net and haul the sub in as if it was some kind of gigantic fish. Some versions of this technique did have remote detonated charges attached to the net so that you could try and sink the sub rather than just haul it around with you, and presumably they also thought of a way to quickly detach said net to make sure you hadn't just invented a very complex and unhelpful sea anchor. The spar torpedo also made a reappearance briefly, the idea being of a small destroyer or torpedo boat approaching a submarine that was on the surface or at periscope depth with a 40-foot or longer spar coming out of the bow of the ship, with which it would then bonk the submarine on the head with an impact-activated explosive charge. Variations on the idea of some kind of grappling line derived from a paravane with attached explosives became the most popular pre-war solution, and some bright sparks were also looking into adopting army mortars to get around the problem that shells fired from guns at submarines tended to, at larger calibers, skip off the water, or at smaller ones that might actually explode on their first impact, lack sufficient blast radius. There was even a brief sojourn into the idea of what were essentially gigantic rifle grenades that could be fitted to the larger guns on cruisers and battleships, which could then travel slower and thus impact the water and stay there. Believe it or not, a few of these techniques, particularly some of the more advanced and intricate grappling line ideas, which included adapting minesweeping gear with explosives instead of wire cutters, would actually claim a few submarines during World War I, although for most of these and other ideas the words of one Royal Navy destroyer captain probably suffice. Any German submarine who got caught in that damn fool device probably deserved to be sunk. Incidentally, if you want a slightly more detailed history of the general progress of anti-submarine warfare, I have done a video on that, link in the video description below. For the moment, though, we're looking at the story of the depth charge in particular. Now, all of these efforts led to a rather confusing array of measures that were mostly ineffective and occasionally downright dangerous to the operating crews when World War I broke out, and the threat of submarines obviously became somewhat more immediate and real. But as 1914 quickly turned into 1915, things hadn't really gotten much better. Outside of the Dardanelles, a hopeful anti-submarine net and boom system had been set up with regular patrols along the boom by ships' boats. Their equipment, however, was described by one of the men aboard. The boom was patrolled at night by 2 picket boats, armed with 3-pounder guns and Maxims, those being machine guns. The senior officer in HMS Exmouth didn't think this was enough, and ordered each boat to embark 2 large blacksmiths armed with flogging hammers to stand one on each side of the coxswain. On a periscope being sighted, the boat was to steal quietly up alongside it, and the nearest blacksmith was then to give it a big whack with his hammer. But hope was coming to those who didn't have very large hammers. Firstly, up in the skies, aircraft were being equipped with adapted bombs. This being the early part of World War I, they of course couldn't carry anything particularly substantial, but the idea was for a series of small bombs to have a grenade-style pull-the-pin fuse inserted. The pin was then attached to a lanyard, which in turn was attached to a small float. The idea was to use the, relatively speaking, high speed of aircraft, along with their better spotting capacity, to fly over submarines and drop bombs on them. The bombs would then sink until the lanyard reached full extension, and the float yanked out and thus activated the pin and the fuse, which would detonate the bomb. The 3 main problems were that the largest bombs available for aircraft only weighed 65 pounds, and only some of that was explosive, so the blast radius really wasn't that great. The lanyard often became tangled on its way down, and this caused shallow detonations. And of course, aircraft could only operate in relatively calm weathers and relatively close to shore for relatively short periods of time, which was not a great help if you were a merchant ship in the middle of the Atlantic or in the western approaches, or if you were a ship of the Grand Fleet in the North Sea, when on any given day a destroyer could be popped up by waves to higher than the masthead of a battleship. But it did represent part of the genesis of an idea that some kind of explosive could be sent down to the depths that the submarines were running at to do them harm there. Another useful innovation of the early war period, although it would take a little more time to reach fruition, was the invention of the hydrophone. As mentioned, this took place at some point in the first year to year and a half of World War I, although sources do disagree on who was the first inventor of it, and whether it was for detecting submarines or for submarines to detect objects on the surface or some other related use altogether. Whatever the case, it wouldn't take too long before the hydrophone would be adapted as the first semi-reliable method of detecting a sub underwater, although initially a vessel had to be stopped or drifting to use one. But the final key for the depth charge came courtesy of two very different men, one Herbert Taylor and John Jellicoe. Taylor was a brilliant mechanical engineer from Surrey in England, and although a civilian, he had quickly recognised that the best way to attack a submarine was of course to get explosives down to it, but of course this required a detonator that could be set off at a chosen and variable depth. He therefore rapidly designed and prototyped what would become known as the hydrostatic pistol. He submitted his design to the Admiralty, who immediately invited him to come and work at HMS Vernon for what was at that stage called the Experimental Mining School. Here, in conjunction with a few others, he would perfect the device to a multi-stage 2-foot-long instrument that was capable of safely and selectively detonating at a chosen depth. Very briefly, the stages to the final form of the hydrostatic pistol worked thus. First, you had to remove a safety pin which immobilized all of the inner workings to stop them being jostled around and potentially activating while you're on the surface. And then, once this had been done and the thing had been chucked overboard, as it sank through the water, first there would be an increase in water pressure which forced an internal piston down. This could be either on a series of fairly weak springs or via bellows, depending on the exact variation of the hydrostatic pistol. But in either case, the internal piston was forced down, and to this there was mounted the firing pin and elements of the explosive train that led from the detonator to the booster charge, which would then set off the main explosive payload. All of this would then be locked into place as it passed by a set of spring-loaded locking balls. Now, the hydrostatic pistol was irrevocably armed. A large spring would now be acted upon by the still increasing water pressure, as there was a plate on the outside. This would then compress the spring further and further and further until sufficient force was reached to cause the firing pin to be actuated, which would set off the chain of combustion that would lead a moment later to a larger explosion. Hence why in the more accurate movies, when a depth charge goes off, you hear a click, followed almost immediately thereafter by a boom. The variation in depth was achieved by a mechanical dial that controlled how much of the spring needed to be compressed before the firing pin was set off. Initially, there was no dial, and the hydrostatic pistol just activated at a set depth of about 40 to 45 feet. Later on, more advanced versions would have two settings, one of which was about double this, and as further versions were developed during the war, more and more depth settings were added. This device seemed to offer much more control than other systems that were being devised at roughly the same time. Ship-based lanyard-operated charges, which were either derivatives of the airdropped variant or the airdrop variant was derivative of them, depending again on which source you read, were much harder to more immediately vary because you'd have to try and measure out the length of the lanyard and make very quick cuts and ties, and the lanyard still had tangling issues. There was also a chemical pellet that was designed to dissolve in water, which worked on a time rather than depth basis, but it was a little bit too variable compared to the hydrostatic pistol, as currents, temperatures, and relative salinity could all affect exactly how quickly the thing dissolved, and it wouldn't necessarily dissolve at an equal rate. While the hydrostatic pistol was being invented and tested ashore and in the shallow coasts off of England, as well as in a few unlucky rivers and tanks, Career Naval Officer John Jellicoe had spent much time pre-war as the third and then later second Sea Lord, and in those roles he'd looked into all sorts of issues regarding British munitions, some of which we've discussed elsewhere, and early on in the war, he was told of an incident, which he would later recount. A submarine fired a torpedo at one of the cruisers. The cruiser saw the periscope and the wake of the torpedo and had little difficulty in so manoeuvring as to avoid being struck. She then went full speed to the spot from which the submarine had fired its torpedo in the hope of ramming it. But by the time she arrived, the submarine had submerged so deeply that the cruiser passed over her without doing any harm. Yet the officers and crew could see the submerged hull. There the enemy lay in full view of her pursuers, and yet perfectly safe. The officers reported this incident to me in the presence of Admiral Madden, second in command. Wouldn't it have been fine if they had on board a mine, so designed that when dropped overboard, it would have exploded when it reached the depth at which the submarine was lying? This incident, in turn, led him to think of a similar idea that had been floated immediately pre-war, but of course suffered from the fact that it lacked a reliable detonator. But by this point, of course, it was 1915, and the hydrostatic pistol's success was quickly becoming known amongst those with an interest in such things, and John Jellicoe had an interest in such things. Sensing the urgency that the situation required, instead of asking for a whole new weapon to be designed around the new detonator, at Jellicoe's request, the usual fuse was removed from a Mark II sea mine, which was a half-ton weapon with an approximately 250-pound gun cotton charge designed to blow a hole in the side of a cruiser or a battleship. For reference, it carried a warhead with about the same amount of explosive power as the German torpedoes which had relatively recently sunk the armoured cruisers Aboukir, Hogue and Cressy, with just a single hit from one such weapon needed to sink a 12,000-ton armoured cruiser, namely the Aboukir. Against a 500 to 800-ton German U-boat, especially with the explosive effects far more contained by detonating deep underwater, the effect would be crushing, to say the least. Plus, of course, the sheer weight of the thing meant that even if the detonator didn't work properly, if you were lucky and had just so happened to have dropped a half-ton steel lump directly on top of a U-boat, the kinetic impact was likely to do bad things to it. About the only problem such a weapon had was that it was far too heavy to be easily moved around at sea by ships that weren't equipped to drop mines, and so the regular vessels that were now equipped with these prototype depth charges had to have them pre-positioned aft in a somewhat precarious manner, which allowed for the releasing of a couple of lines and a good shove to send them crashing down into the depths. There was, of course, another issue. Friendly ships weren't really supposed to be anywhere near major sea mines when they went off, and the effect of such a weapon detonating in the wake of a ship trying to sink a submarine could potentially be rather devastating for the launching ship as well if it didn't skedaddle rather quickly. And most anti-submarine warfare hunting vessels of World War I either weren't very fast at all, or they weren't going very fast when they dropped their charges. For this, two directions were initially taken. The Type F depth charge carried a mere 70 pounds of explosive, and was light enough to be fired from a so-called bomb thrower, a small adjustable mortar which could thus be mounted on practically anything, including merchantmen. Of course, you had to get such a charge within about a dozen feet of a submarine to do any damage, which would be something of a tall order for a single-shot weapon in World War II, let alone World War I, and therefore was not very successful, with most sources either crediting it with no success whatsoever or possibly a single instance. The other direction that was taken came with the development of the Type D depth charge, with the initial need for something fulfilled by the adapted sea mines, now named cruiser mines, in both Mark I, which wasn't very successful, or Mark II, some more successful forms. A brief rethink of a fully purpose-built weapon saw the weight of the first purpose design and widely built depth charge, equipped from the start with a hydrostatic pistol, manage to reduce down to about 420 pounds, which was just over 190 kilos. This was useful, as it meant that more of them could be carried on any given ship, and the new shape, which was akin to an oversized metal beer keg or a slightly undersized oil drum, made it much easier and much safer to move around. The only problem was that, in the manner of so many British scientists who, when removed from their natural environment, the garden shed, tend to lose track of quite exactly what they're supposed to be doing in all particulars, the Type D also came with an even bigger charge than Jellicoe's half-ton Sphere of Doom, with a 300-pound TNT warhead fitted. This meant that it seemed the new depth charges could only ever be used by ships that were fast enough to run away from them, which generally meant you'd fit them to destroyers, although one, if not maybe even the first unfortunate submarine to fall victim to a depth charge, at least in part, was the U-68, which was engaged by a Q ship, HMS Farnborough. U-68 tried to dive to escape the gunfire when the Farnborough revealed its nature, and the submarine then had a depth charge dropped on it for its troubles, which, according to some accounts, detonated underneath it and blew the sub clean out of the water bow first, whilst other accounts claim that the sub tried to surface after the detonation with heavy damage evident on the bow. In either case, the submarine was then finished off by gunfire from the Farnborough. At the other end of 1916 came the first directly attributable victim of depth charges. This was either the submarine UC-19 or possibly UB-29, both of which were lost in December of that year in the aftermath of depth charge attacks by Royal Navy destroyers, although there is some debate as to exactly what occurred in each case, and whether one of them maybe limped off or struck a mine later on or something else. But in either case, either UC-19 or UB-29 in December 1916 was the first victim of the new depth charge. There were two solutions to the overly enthusiastic explosive tendencies of the Type D. One was the Type D Star. Externally, this was the same size, but internally it was a pint-sized version that was half the weight, with just under half the charge. This was still 120 pounds though, and so it also had a small underwater parachute to help slow its descent. The D Star could then be used with a degree of safety by slower vessels. The other option, which was allowed for by the Type D's reduction in weight compared to the cruiser mine, was to invent a device capable of throwing the depth charge away from the ship. Initially, this came courtesy of the Thornycroft Depth Charge Thrower, which used the charge from a 2-pounder or 40mm cannon to throw a depth charge about 120 feet through the air. This might look familiar to many of you, at least in basic concept, and it was issued to the Royal Navy within a year of development starting. But deployment at scale of all these things was becoming a problem. The depth charge thrower was complex and took time to build, and depth charges were in general being expended far faster than they were being made. But with US entry into the war in 1917, there was an opportunity. As with many other aspects of cutting-edge modern warfare developed during the conflict, everything from tanks to aircraft and, as it turned out, anti-submarine warfare, the US was, understandably, having not been involved in said war, a few years behind. And so a mutually beneficial arrangement was arrived at. The UK supplied examples and drawings for the Type D depth charge and the depth charge thrower to the US, in exchange for which the US would use its largely untapped industrial capacity to mass manufacture these weapons for both themselves and the Royal Navy. This largely worked. The depth charge thrower was simplified into the K gun and the Y gun. These were capable of launching 1 or 2 depth charges, respectively, and were named after their profiles when you looked aft. And sufficient Type D depth charges were made that vessels went from carrying 2 or 4 of them to 30 or more by the end of the war. The depth charge throwers also meant that the Type D star was no longer needed, and whereas in 1916 just over 3,000 depth charges had been issued, resulting in a claim of 3 kills on U-boats, in 1917 just over 20,000 were issued, with 11 more sunken U-boats estimated, and in 1918 over 51,000 charges were issued, which accounted for ostensibly 24 U-boats destroyed in that year. This was of course helped by the further refinements to hydrophones, which allowed submarines to be better tracked underwater, and by continuing developments with the hydrostatic pistol, making it both safer and more able to operate in both shallow and deep water environments, with an increasing variety of settings. Of particular use was the introduction in 1917 of the directional hydrophone, which would allow a ship to use the device whilst underway rather than stopped or drifting, although the total number of successful attacks on U-boats linked to hydrophone use specifically, as opposed to visual spotting and other more traditional ways of working out where a sub was, remained relatively small in the First World War. But even when a depth charge attack did not sink a submarine, it would often cause enough damage to impair the vessel's ability to operate effectively, often forcing it to return to port in somewhat suboptimal condition. And with no prior experience of being depth charged prior to 1916 and thus no opportunity to train to cope with it, quite a number of otherwise experienced U-boat crews reported significant impacts on crew morale and in some cases even individual crewmen's ability to operate, at least at first. There was a degree of getting used to it, assuming that you survived. And so it was that the depth charge finally reached widespread operational use, just in time for World War I to end. However, since the Type D seemed to be pretty useful in general, it saw remarkably little development over the interwar period, with most effort on new anti-submarine warfare focusing on the development of ASDIC, aka sonar, to better enable the delivery of the depth charges to the target in the first place. Come World War II, the Type D was simply relabelled as the Mark VII depth charge, and would go on to form the basis of the Royal Navy's anti-submarine warfare weaponry in the early part of the Second World War. But the interwar and World War II anti-submarine warfare efforts are better told separately, starting off at least with the development of ASDIC, and thus that brings this story on the origin of the depth charge to a close.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.